Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight. This is a webinar series that Healthy for Life does. We do this once a month and have some wonderful speakers who are willing to come and share their knowledge related to health and well-being. Tonight we have Dr. Julia Buchkina. Julia trained at the University of Iowa. She's the founder of Upstream Functional Medicine in Iowa City. Julia is a board-certified family medicine doctor, certified in functional medicine, and a diplomate of the American Board of Integrative Holistic Medicine. I met Julia, 10 years ago, and Julia was kind enough to vet Healthy for Life University at the clinic that she was working at the time. She had not left the University of Iowa yet. It was very kind of her, and her clinic was gave a thumbs up to Healthy for Life University. So that's how I met Julia, and we've become friends. And I did a little bit of work for her. I did some health coaching with some of her clients at the time. So without further ado, Julia is going to speak about the microbiome. Many of our customers come in and ask about what is the microbiome, what do I do about it? It's getting a lot of press because we're learning how important it is, particularly to the immune system. It's where the immune system is kind of housed in some ways. And so without further ado, I'm going to turn this over to Julia. When Julia is finished, you can ask questions and I will be the moderator of those questions. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you so much, Tim. Can you hear me okay? All right. Well, thanks so much for having me and thanks for those kind words. So as Tim said, I'm Julia Buchkina. I'm a functional medicine physician and I own Upstream Functional Medicine in Iowa City. I opened my practice about 5 years ago when I decided to devote the practice of medicine to lifestyle changes and how I can help people need fewer medicines over time and regain vibrancy within their life when they're having chronic diseases or chronic symptoms related to diseases that we can modify through lifestyle. And so I'm excited to talk about the microbiome because, as Tim said, there is so much information coming out about the microbiome, yet it's one of those topics that we've barely even scratched the surface. And it's something that we still don't know the majority of what there is to know about. And so there's always new information coming out. And yet with what we already know, we're able to enact nutritional interventions and lifestyle changes for people in all sorts of chronic disease to modulate the microbiome and get really great clinical outcomes. And so one of our maxims in functional medicine is that all disease starts in the gut. And so what we're going to focus on tonight with the microbiome is specifically the microbes that live in our gut. However, we have microbiota everywhere in the body. And so our skin has its own microbiome. Our nasal mucosa has its own set of bacteria and yeast that inhabit it and keep the balance happy. We have gut bacteria in all parts of the gut. The mouth has its own bacteria. And then we also have bacteria in the vaginal canal. Men have their own genitourinary flora. And so it is something that truly affects the entire body. But of course, when most people hear the word microbiome, we think about the gut. So we're going to focus on the gut tonight. So first, what is the microbiome? Our bodies contain greater than 100 trillion microorganisms, and together we refer to that as our gut microbiome. Scientists estimate that bacterial cells outnumber human cells in our bodies by 10 to 1. So just think about that. We are basically shells walking around for bacteria. If you think about it genetically, the gut microbiome encodes over 3 million genes, producing thousands of metabolites, whereas the human genome only has 23,000 genes. And so the genetic capacity of the bacteria living within us is incredible. We also have what's called a mycobiome, so M-Y-C-O-B-I-O-M-E, and that's our fungal biome, where we have good and bad yeasts and fungi that also work with the bacteria to promote immune health, or in some cases work against our immune health. And so if we look deeper into the microorganisms that make up the microbiome, we think of the different groups of bacteria within what's called phyla. So if you ever studied biology in high school and you learned about the taxonomy of biologic systems, you're familiar with that term. The two most commonly referred to phyla, or big groups of bacteria, are Firmicutes and Bacteroidetes. So if you ever read about microbiome research, those terms are probably going to come up. Now, the Bacteroidetes group represents over 90% of our gut microbiota, whereas the Firmicutes is fewer in general. However, most of the probiotics we see over the counter, like at the health food store, are going to contain Firmicutes. That's our lactobacillus, our bifidobacterium, the things we're usually going to see on the labels. Now, the history of probiotics dates back to the work of Eli Michnikov, who really introduced the concept of probiotics in the early 20th century. He's known as the father of probiotics. He was the first to propose that consuming beneficial microorganisms could actually have an effect on people's health. And if you think about the word probiotic and break it down, it really means to benefit life, probiotic. And so probiotics truly mean good bacteria, or bacteria supporting life. So when we think about the specific microorganisms that make up probiotics we see on the shelves at the grocery store, typically we're going to see lactobacillus and bifidobacterium. Lactobacillus produce short-chain fatty acids, or you might see it written sometimes as SCFAs. And they're a particular type of acid that nourish the gut wall. When people are eating a standard American diet, of course we call that SAD, right? They usually don't make enough short-chain fatty acids to nourish the colon wall. And in the absence of SCFAs, the colon can get sick. And we see diseases like inflammatory bowel disease or irritable bowel syndrome. Lactobacillus is most helpful for controlling diarrhea when we think about the clinical applications of using a probiotic. It's also helpful for reducing inflammation. And then it is helpful for fighting candida, which is one of the most common pathogenic yeasts. And then we also often see bifidobacterium. Bifidobacteria also help produce these short-chain fatty acids that lower inflammation and nourish the colon wall. But then they're also helpful for improving the GI barrier, and they can lower something called LPS, or lipopolysaccharide levels, that come from gram-negative bacteria that can often inhabit the gut. So that's one of the more common types of dysbiotic bacteria, bad bacteria, that we might want to combat. And then one of the newer stars of the probiotic market is something called bacillus. And bacillus is a type of soil-based organism. It helps to calm irritable bowel syndrome. And also, more recently, research is showing that it helps to heal intestinal permeability. And so we know that intestinal permeability, or leaky gut, where the tight junctions between the epithelial cells and the intestines loosen up and allow for the gut contents to interact with the immune system on the other side, which can then cause autoimmunity, inflammation, and cancer. This can help heal that permeability and tighten the cells back up. And then bacillus can also help with intestinal motility. So probiotics can have a variety of effects on the body and can affect different people differently. And so even though, as I talk tonight about specific strains that may be associated with certain clinical uses, keep in mind that everybody's body is unique. And even though certain research studies show that certain strains are good for different conditions, they may not be the right thing for you. So my disclaimer is always that if I am not your functional medicine physician and you want to try a probiotic or are wondering if a certain strain would be best for you, it's always best to talk to your own personal physician. And certainly if you try probiotics over the counter and don't have the intended effect, it's best to see your physician to investigate what else you can do. So are probiotics safe? You know, whenever any research study within medicine looks at a new intervention, the first type of study that they do is a safety and tolerability study. And luckily, most probiotics are highly safe and very well tolerated by most people. At most, they may cause some mild digestive symptoms, which just are associated with your microbiome getting used to the new bacteria as you start taking it. However, if you do have underlying medical problems, you've recently had surgery, especially in the bowels, or if you have a weakened immune system, if you're immune compromised, I always recommend checking with your doctor before starting something like a probiotic. Another specific medical condition that can actually be worsened by taking a probiotic is called SIBO, small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. And it's actually one of the most common conditions that I help to treat. What happens in SIBO is you have the migration of normal good bacteria from the colon, and it migrates up through the ileocecal valve, which is the separation between the colon and the small intestine. Now, there's supposed to be relatively few bacteria in the small intestine, fewer than, say, 100,000, which, of course, when we're talking about all the bacteria in the microbiome, over 100 trillion, it's like a drop in the ocean. And so when we get the migration of too much bacteria into the small intestine, we get problems. And since good bacteria can be the cause of the problem, it's just an issue of it being in the wrong place. Taking a probiotic pill can actually make it worse. And so I never recommend that anybody take probiotics if they suspect they have SIBO until we have tested and treated for it. So the next few slides are going to highlight some specific conditions and the strains of bacteria that research studies have shown they are helpful for. And so for diarrhea, which is probably the condition that probiotics are best studied for, we know that both single and multi-strain probiotics can reduce the duration of infectious diarrhea, like a traveler's diarrhea, for an average of 25 hours. So that's significant because if you've ever had infectious diarrhea and it lasts more than a day or two, you know how debilitating it can be. So to gain a day back of your life because of something that you can get over the counter and feel better soon is a good thing, right? And so the study also found that probiotics reduce the risk of traveler's diarrhea by 8% when taken prophylactically, and lowered the risk of diarrhea from other causes by 57% in children and 26% in adults. And it's specifically the strain Lactobacillus rhamnosus GG, which can be found in the commercial product Culturelle, that is most helpful for infectious diarrhea. And if you get the lowest dose strain of Culturelle over the counter, it will have 10 billion CFU, which is the minimum dose that you would want to take for an infectious diarrhea. And next, there has been a number of new studies on mental health and probiotics. So we've known for a long time about this critical link between the gut and the brain. In fact, the gut is called our second brain. And when you read about neurotransmitters and the side effects that certain antidepressant or anti-anxiety medications can have an effect on, it actually influences the amount of neurotransmitters in the gut first before it influences the central nervous system. So when people have side effects to taking a new antidepressant or anti-anxiety medicine, it's often in the gut. And so I always chuckle when I see commercials on TV about side effects, because really in conventional medicine, we have started calling the effects of medicines that we don't like side effects, but really they're just effects. Medicine affects all of the systems in the body when it's absorbed into the systemic circulation. And so that's why so many different interactions can happen when you've got, you know, 2 or more medications on board. And of course, that's what I'm passionate about doing, is helping people reduce the number of medications that they need with lifestyle changes. So the specific strains that can be helpful for mental health are Lactobacillus helveticus and Bifidobacterium longum, and they both work better together instead of apart to help with depression and anxiety. And next, probiotics are also helpful for allergies and allergic diseases. So one of the most common allergic diseases that we see in kids, especially in infants, is eczema. One study found that the children of women who took probiotics during pregnancy had an 83% lower risk of developing eczema in the first 2 years of life. And that's another thing that we really enjoy helping people with in our clinic, is healthy families getting started early in life, especially starting with mom's pregnancy. So we talk a lot about nutrition, as well as supplements and nutrients that can help reduce the risk of chronic diseases in children before they are born. So for eczema, the strains that are most helpful are Lactobacillus rhamnosus, Bifidobacterium lactis, and then Lactobacillus acidophilus, which most of us are familiar with from yogurt, right? So we're used to going to the doctor, getting a course of antibiotics, and then hearing, go eat some yogurt, it's got acidophilus in it, you'll repopulate the good bacteria, which of course is a grand simplification of what's happening, but acidophilus bacteria is absolutely helpful at repopulating the good bacteria that are often reduced with certain antibiotics. And then ultimately, you know, about 2 weeks after you stop taking yogurt and you finish your antibiotics, the part of the puzzle that we don't hear from our physicians usually is that if you don't keep eating yogurt, you're going to lose the acidophilus. But it's okay. We're going to talk about ways to keep it around for the long term a little bit later. So now let's talk about probiotics for the immune system. So we know that the types of bacteria living in the gut can influence whether a part of our immune system is too active or not active enough. When somebody is diagnosed with an autoimmune disease, it usually signals that one part of the immune system is too active and another part is not active enough. And what we help to do in functional medicine is figure out how to balance the 2 sides of the immune system so that the body calms down, we reduce inflammation and increase function. So there was a review that found that taking probiotics reduces the likelihood and duration of respiratory infections in children, specifically Lactobacillus GG, again, Culturelle, lots of studies on Culturelle if you type it into the search engine at PubMed. And Lactobacillus GG reduced the frequency and severity of respiratory infections by 17% in the study. And so it's a good choice to take throughout cold and flu season. Now, until recently, there hasn't been a lot of good research on probiotics for weight loss. However, we're getting more and more information as it comes out. And so there are a few different ways that probiotics help with weight loss. One way is there are some probiotics that prevent the absorption of dietary fat in the intestine, and help it to be excreted in the feces rather than being stored in the body. Other probiotics can help you feel fuller longer, resulting in more calories burned and less fat stored. In one study, dieting women who took Lactobacillus rhamnosus for 3 months lost 50% more weight than women who didn't take a probiotic. Another study of over 200 people found that taking even low doses of another type of lactobacillus called Lactobacillus gasseri for 12 weeks resulted in an 8.5% reduction of belly fat. However, there's another type of lactobacillus that we've found can actually cause weight gain. So that's confusing, right? And that's where we really have to be cautious about the reproducibility of the studies that are coming out, and also what other confounding factors could be contributing to the data we get. So the Lactobacillus acidophilus that's in yogurt is what's been found to potentially lead to weight gain in some studies. So I like to call this a situation of we don't know what we don't know. Some of you may be familiar with the idea of fecal transplants. And so fecal transplants started gaining more traction in the media, and especially among people who were using the functional medicine approach about 8 years ago, when we found that it was highly effective for treating C. difficile colitis. And so C. difficile colitis is an antibiotic treatment-related colitis that can occur after a course of antibiotics. And it can be quite serious, life-threatening, in fact. And so people develop severe diarrhea leading to dehydration and often organ failure because of the dehydration, and end up in the intensive care unit. And so often, you know, there's no other treatment that can effectively help the person get over this infection other than just supportive care. However, about a decade ago, they started using fecal transplants from healthy donors who didn't have Clostridium difficile colitis, and found that if the fecal transplant, so the healthy stool was taken from a person who is not ill, was either infused into the GI tract of the sick person through a nasogastric tube or through an enema, it was almost instantaneously curative for this life-threatening illness. And so, you know, what a wonderful thing to have access to, right? However, one of the first cases of C. difficile colitis that was cured with a fecal transplant was in a young 20-something female who had been thin her whole life. And she received the curative transplant from her healthy mother, who happened to be obese. And following the fecal transplant, that girl gained about 50 pounds and could not figure out how to lose it. Now, she was alive. And so thank goodness for this curative treatment. But what that case illustrates to me is there's so much that we don't know about how the microbiome influences our health. We know about its immune effects. We know that having a balance of the good versus bad bacteria is critical for long-term health, but we don't necessarily understand all the ins and outs of how it affects our metabolism. And so this, of course, will hopefully emerge with more research. But I always caution my patients that come in, especially with autoimmunity, because in places like Australia or Europe, they are using fecal transplants now a little bit more liberally than we do here in the United States, where we have a very strict process for medical treatments, where the FDA has to approve things for a certain specific clinical use. Yet what people have started doing now is, as you can imagine, when you get so disparate with a medical condition that conventional medicine isn't helping you with, you might go online and consult Dr. Google. And there are people who have resorted to making and administering their own fecal transplants. you get your Vitamix out and you get a healthy family member who can give you some healthy stool, you know, what's the harm, you might think, in just doing a home transplant? Yet I always bring up that case where that woman, you know, had her life changed significantly onward just because we didn't know exactly what effect the transplant was going to have on her metabolism. So we've talked a lot about probiotics. Now I want to shift to speaking about prebiotics. So prebiotics are the food for healthy probiotic bacteria. The most straightforward way to describe prebiotics is as a fiber. But more accurately, it is a type of carbohydrate that is not digested well and absorbed by the body. It's something that stays in the colon the entire trek from the mouth to the rectum. So it's not broken down by the gut. When it enters the colon, it ferments and feeds the gut microflora. And so taking prebiotics are actually the best way to ensure a good balance of microbiota in the colon. If you think about how stable and sturdy a probiotic has to be from the time of manufacture to the time that it hits your stomach and encounters stomach acid, there's not a lot that we can do to guarantee that every single bacteria that's present at the time of manufacture is actually going to make it to the colon intact. The better strategy is to combine probiotics with prebiotics. For that reason, if you take a probiotic, I always recommend taking it with a meal, which differs from what's written on a lot of probiotic labels. It always says, take it on an empty stomach. And that doesn't make any sense to me, because if we want to give the bacteria food for the long journey, you want to take it with a meal, specifically a meal containing non-starchy vegetables. Now, you could take it a few minutes before the meal. It doesn't have to be right with the meal. And in fact, studies show that you get the best outcome for taking antibiotics if you take the pill within 30 minutes before a meal or right at the beginning of the meal. Taking it after the meal does not have as much of a benefit. Now, many of you are familiar with probiotic foods and may have heard of or even tried kombucha. So kombucha has really become very popular the last few years. It is a popular fermented drink made from black or green tea that has been fermented by a friendly colony of bacteria and yeast. Many people who try kombucha for the first time and aren't used to taking any kind of probiotic might actually have some digestive symptoms. And so if you try kombucha and you get bloated or you have gastrointestinal reflux and you feel like you have heartburn afterward, I would wonder if you have an overgrowth of bacteria or yeast in the small intestine, and it may be something to talk to your physician about. Now, a lot of my patients ask, should I be drinking kombucha every day? Is it better to drink kombucha than take a high-dose probiotic? And the answer really is no. Kombucha is much better for us than a sugary soda. It's a great alternative to, any kind of sugary drink if you're feeling like something fizzy. But the actual amount of good bacteria and yeast in, say, a 20-ounce bottle of kombucha is relatively low. It's going to be in the millions to maybe 1 billion, which clinically isn't going to have much of an effect. So especially if you do have any digestive issues and you suspect that there is some sort of overgrowth that your physician may need to address, I would not recommend going out and drinking lots of kombucha. However, it can be a healthful thing to include in your diet on a, maybe a weekly basis or something to have at celebratory events. It's always a better choice than soda. And of course, we're all familiar with the presence of healthy probiotics in yogurt and kefir. Yogurt is one of the easiest ways and one of the most time-honored traditions of different societies making fermented foods using milk and friendly bacteria. And so when you're choosing a yogurt, it's always important to avoid any with added sugar. You want to make sure that they all say live cultures and that you're getting something that is fresh. Yogurt is not too difficult to make at home if you have a dehydrator or a yogurt maker. And in fact, if you are lactose intolerant, the best way to make yogurt is to ferment it at home for a 24-hour period. Now, a close relative to yogurt is KEFIR, and this is a probiotic milk drink that originated from Bulgaria. It is specifically cultured with Lactobacillus bulgaricus, and interestingly, this strain of bacteria is the most helpful for healing intestinal permeability. Some of my patients who cannot tolerate any dairy at all are able to tolerate KEFIR. And so especially if one of the primary goals that we have working together is to heal the gut and heal autoimmunity, sometimes they are able to tolerate some KEFIR when we can't do any other dairy. And my fun fact for you all is the word KEFIR actually comes from the Turkish word keyif, which means feeling good after eating. And if you've ever experienced drinking KEFIR and feeling really good, that's exactly how it was named. Another example of how the microbiota in our gut affect our mood. And then we also can make richly fermented vegetables in sauerkraut, kimchi, and really any other type of fermented vegetable. So sauerkraut and kimchi use the cabbage leaves, but you can make fermented carrots. Ginger carrots are one of my favorite. You can have pickles, beets, really any vegetable that's non-starchy and doesn't have a lot of sugar in it is going to ferment well. Fermented cabbage has been eaten all over the world for centuries and has a lot of health benefits, as well as being rich in prebiotic fiber. It has vitamin C, B, K, iron, and antioxidants like lutein and zeaxanthin, which are good for the eyes. And kimchi, which is the spicy Korean version of sauerkraut, also contains traditionally a specific bacteria called Lactobacillus kimchi that is beneficial for digestive health. So what if you've been working really hard on gut healing, you've been taking a probiotic, you've been eating fermented vegetables and fermented foods, and then all of a sudden something happens, you get an infection and you have to take a prescription for antibiotics. Is it gonna wipe out all of the hard work that you've been doing? No, it's not. And I am absolutely not opposed to using antibiotics when we need them. That's one of the benefits of modern medicine, right? We've just got a wider toolkit to use both natural and conventional things. So I absolutely don't recommend foregoing antibiotics if you've got a bad strep throat or an ear infection or a cellulitis. There is a specific protocol that I recommend following while you're taking the antibiotic to make sure that your microbiome is going to bounce back quickly. The top thing is to avoid sugar as much as possible while taking the antibiotic, because sugar is really what grows bad bacteria in the gut. Next is to eat as many non-starchy vegetables a day while you're on antibiotics as you can. Now, that's just good common sense to me, and I recommend that everybody do that every day, even when you're not taking antibiotics. But the other thing that you can do while you're taking antibiotics is to add a prebiotic fiber so that it's going to encourage the regrowth of good bacteria while you're taking the antibiotics and killing the bad bacteria and not eating any sugar to grow more bacteria. So every person is individual, and that is one of our other maxims in functional medicine. the lifestyle protocol that works for one person's diabetes may be the completely wrong protocol to use for another person's diabetes. The same with the microbiome. A probiotic that's helpful for one person with multiple sclerosis or depression or rheumatoid arthritis may be the wrong probiotic for somebody else with those same conditions. So it's important to trust your gut, listen to your body, and if you try something, whether it's a fermented food, a prebiotic fiber, or a probiotic over the counter, and it's not feeling well, it's time to talk to your physician and figure out a personalized protocol that works for you. When you are at the store and you're trying to pick out a probiotic, it can make a difference paying attention to a couple of different things on the label. The first is, of course, making sure that there is a certification on the bottle that guarantees a certain amount of live cultures at the time of manufacture. And then the second is what that number is. And so I recommend that each dose of probiotic, to have a clinically useful effect, contain at least 10 billion live organisms. And sometimes you see that written on the bottle as CFU, which stands for colony forming units. Now, some studies have shown that getting a wide array of probiotics can be more helpful specifically for digestion. And so if you have a digestive issue, looking for a product that contains 10 or more strains may be more helpful than one that contains just 1 or 2. However, I'm going to conclude with a study that really highlights the power of just eating good, clean, real food, which is much more powerful than any probiotic pill that you can get over the counter. And it was a study that was presented at our annual Institute for Functional Medicine conference a couple years ago. And it's an ongoing crowdsourced research project called the American Gut Project. And it's at the University of Colorado Boulder. Anybody can Google American Gut and even participate in the study if you'd like to. And so what you do is you submit your stool sample, and what they're doing is they are collecting essentially just a catalog of the American gut. They are testing American stool and figuring out what is growing in our microbiome, and then comparing different conditions that people have, different dietary patterns that people have, and figuring out how the microbiome changes over time. And so they do different cohort breakout studies with all of the crowdsourced stool samples that people send in. And one of the most eloquent studies that they did was they took a group of people who were eating a standard American diet. So lots of restaurant food, sugary food, processed foods, and they took a baseline stool sample. Then those people switched to a completely plant-based smoothie diet, green smoothies, for 3 days. At the end of the 3 days, they took another stool sample. And what they found is within that 72 hours, the microbiome had completely flipped. So at the baseline sample, the people who were eating the standard diet had lots of pro-inflammatory bacteria, not a lot of good anti-inflammatory probiotic bacteria. At the end of 72 hours, it was the opposite. They had lots of good anti-inflammatory bacteria, not a lot of bad bacteria. They were not taking probiotics. All they were doing was drinking liquefied plants, greens and fruits and water. And that significant of a change happened within 3 days. So if you think about the next time you need to take antibiotics, how much power are you going to have over what your microbiome looks like 72 hours after you finish your course of antibiotics? You have complete control over it. So that's exciting. Now, the follow-up to that study was that they did a follow-up stool sample 2 weeks after the 3 days of green smoothies. In those 2 weeks, people went back to eating their sad standard American diet, lots of sugar, processed food, not a lot of vegetables, and they did another stool sample. And there was no change from baseline. So as soon as they stopped eating the good, healthy plant material, they were right back to where they were, with bad inflammatory bacteria controlling the microbiome, not a lot of good anti-inflammatory bacteria. So the take-home point is the best probiotic may simply be eating good old vegetables and plants. And that doesn't mean we all have to be vegans or vegetarians, but any healthy dietary approach is going to contain whole foods, it's going to eliminate sugar, and it's going to contain a lot of that prebiotic healthy vegetable fiber. With that, thank you so much for taking time out of your busy days to listen to me talk about the microbiome, and I'm happy to open it up to questions.
Yes, I'm going to jump in here too, and I'm going to be the moderator of those questions. And the first question I see here is, Julia, would you comment on how much power do people really have over their health?
Well, I think that they have a lot of power just based on that last anecdote. Now, the question that we always have to ask when we maybe are doing some of these lifestyle interventions and people aren't getting the outcomes that they are wanting, you know, there is a point where some diseases progress past a point where they can be completely reversed. But with a lot of conditions that are chronic, autoimmune conditions, and then metabolic lifestyle conditions like hypertension, diabetes, metabolic syndrome, we talk about being in remission. And so the lifestyle changes and nutritional interventions that are able to get you to start reversing your symptoms will likely need to be continued long-term. Just like those green smoothies, you know, when you do a 3-day smoothie cleanse once a January and then eat whatever you want the rest of the year, you're probably not going to have the same outcome for your health as you would completely shifting the diet to something else. But the thing I love about functional medicine is there's always a new layer to uncover. There's always another layer of the onion to peel. When we aren't getting the results we want, there's usually something, you know, part of the functional medicine matrix, which is just the system we use to investigate imbalances within the body that we haven't investigated. And so we always have something else to be looking into and a way to be moving forward with your health.
Julius, Robin asks, what is your opinion about the probiotic, prebiotic combo in a supplement where they're joined, like chicory or something like that?
Yeah, I think it makes a lot of clinical sense because, again, when you're feeding the good bacteria along the journey through the entire intestinal tract, it's more likely that those bacteria are going to survive and make it all the way to the colon, which is where we want them to have their effect.
Right. Cool. Someone asks, artificial sweeteners of any kind, good for the gut, bad for the gut?
That's a great question. It's kind of a loaded question. Some of them are good and some of them are bad. Mm-hmm. The one with the best clinical outcome for the gut is stevia, which is just from a leaf. You know, it's an herb. There's some evidence that stevia helps to bust through biofilms, which can be an issue in stubborn cases of overgrowth, where essentially the bacteria or the fungi that are left after, say, a treatment of antibiotics or antifungals might be hiding through like a thick sheath that basically is protecting the remaining bacteria from your immune system. And stevia can actually go through and break up that film and reveal the hiding bacteria. However, most of the other artificial sweeteners are not so good for the gut and also don't seem to be that great for metabolic function. Now, another one that is pretty common when people are trying to follow a low carb diet would be erythritol, which is a sugar alcohol. Sugar alcohols can be a problem if you've got SIBO. because that's going to cause fermentation, bloating, pain as it's traveling through the small intestine. However, it's going to be helpful for fermenting the good bacteria once it gets to the colon. So if you are using an artificial sweetener or something with erythritol in it, or xylitol is another common one, and you get bloated within 1 to 2 hours of eating it, that could suggest that you do have SIBO and you need to have a test for that. Whereas if you are getting some fermentation, some intestinal gas, 3 or 4 hours after eating it, that's pretty normal. Prebiotics do tend to make people gassy. It's all about the timing. As Dr. Walls says, fart proudly. As long as it's not an hour after the food, you can tell that it's in the right spot and it's doing what it needs to do to grow the healthy bacteria.
Gotcha. Julia, one of our listeners said, I was diagnosed with IBS, confirmed by a colonoscopy/biopsy. I did diet and lifestyle change 1 year ago. I had another colonoscopy with biopsy. There were no signs of inflammation. And the follow-up, that's a statement. The question to that is, would my gut be considered normal?
If the colonoscopy showed no signs of inflammation, then that means that your condition went into remission, which is the best news you can hear. Now, there are some other tests that can help you determine the specific balance between some of these other probiotics versus dysbiotic bacteria that you wouldn't be able to test on a colonoscopy. And so that would be something like a functional stool profile, which you would be able to get through a functional medicine physician. The other thing that's nice about those profiles that would just give you, that additional information you might be looking for, say between colonoscopies, would be some of the inflammatory markers that we can do with those tests. One of the key ones for the colon is called fecal calprotectin. In fact, several years before colon cancer spreads, we would be able to detect calprotectin rising in a stool sample. And I have had people who we detect the calprotectin rising and they go for their colonoscopy and they're able to catch it early. That can also be true for inflammatory bowel disease. And so, some people, if they're not getting a colonoscopy after age 50, they don't know, for sure what's going on. And so that can be another helpful way to just get more information about exactly what's going on. But a totally normal looking colonoscopy a year after follow-up is really good news. So congratulations to you.
Yeah, Julia, that raises the question when you use the term in remission. As a physician who's seen all kinds of things, is there such a thing as people returning to complete health? Or is this person just, they're in remission, but you never know, it could return at any time? Because they've put things into their lives that have seemed to be going toward health and I would say cured of the condition that their diet and lifestyle had produced.
Yeah.
Can you comment on that?
Well, and I would comment on that by saying it really depends whether they continue the lifestyle changes and practices that led them to that remission or cure. So there's a great book called Radical Remission. You may have read it, but it follows the 10 things that all stage 4 cancer survivors have in common. And a lot of the things are things you would expect, like taking sugar out of your diet or exercising, getting enough sleep. But some of them you wouldn't necessarily think of off the top of your head if you weren't looking at it in a research study. Things like staying connected, practicing a religion, avoiding loneliness. And so all of those things come together to determine whether or not you maintain that cure. And I would say if the disease would redevelop in the future, the key would be to hone in on what has changed within the lifestyle, within the person's environment, and are some of those physiologic imbalances coming back? And then working to rebalance and readdress those.
Here's a question is, in your practice, Julia, what would you say is the greatest motivation for people changing their lifestyles toward health?
I see a lot of loss of function. You know, when people are no longer to do the things that they just love to do, that they live for, there's a level of desperation that can occur. And until people get to that point, making some of these lifestyle changes a sustainable new practice maybe doesn't seem as important or even practical or doable. But when you start being unable to do the things that you've just always been able to do and that give you your life purpose and meaning, you're willing to do pretty much anything to get it back. Mm-hmm. And so I would say, you know, that's the thing that I most commonly see. And usually when I work with patients, you know, there's always a specific goal of, I want to get back to this. You know, when I can do this again, I will have achieved the clinical outcome that I want. And it could be, you know, being able to knit again if they have arthritis in their hands, or, you know, when somebody's in a wheelchair, being able to stand up and walk around, even if it's just 2 hours out of the day. You know, that's a huge thing. So it's really all about function.
Mm-hmm. Here's a question I have for you. Would you talk a little bit about when folks come to you who are on multiple medications, where do you start? Could you talk to our audience about what do you look at? What do you, how do you approach that? Do you have a process or a protocol, or could you just talk through that for a minute or so?
Sure. So the first thing is that we never stop medications before the physiologic issue is under control. I absolutely respect medications for what they do, bridging the transition process. That said, we often will start with the gut and figure out if there is any kind of inflammation that we can quiet down immediately, which will have a ripple effect on all the other organ systems. You know, most people don't realize that the cardiovascular system is related to the gut. The skin is related to the gut. You know, everything is connected. Asthma and lung diseases are related to the gut. And so if we're able to make a significant change in those symptoms just from cleaning up what is going on with digestion, then people are able to see right away that, you know, those lifestyle changes are going to make an impact. And that makes it easier to integrate some of the other lifestyle pillars that we talk about: mindfulness and meditation, biofeedback, sleep hygiene, therapeutic movement. And so as we are able to, and it usually takes 2 to 3 months before we're able to start trying the weaning process, we're able to start reducing doses of medications. Now, especially with autoimmune disease, where there may have been a significant amount of organ damage, whichever organ is affected by a particular autoimmune process, where there is not going to be the possibility of completely eliminating a medicine. The most common place where I see this is Hashimoto's thyroiditis, where the immune system attacks the thyroid gland, which is responsible for metabolism. And creates a situation where the healthy tissue turns into benign cartilage. So it's not a bad type of tissue, it's not cancer, it's never going to cause a problem. But that cartilage, which is like the tip of your nose, is never going to produce thyroid hormone again. And you would not want to be in a situation where you stop taking the thyroid medication and your body isn't getting enough of the thyroid hormone into the cells. And so ultimately, we have to respect the process of every single individual's body and how it finds physiologic balance. You know, I recently had a woman with Hashimoto's who within 2 months actually swung back to having hyperthyroidism after doing an elimination diet and treating the gut. She actually had C. difficile colitis. Once we treated that, she all of a sudden started having palpitations. She was losing lots of weight. She was having diarrhea. And what happened was all of a sudden she was on too much thyroid medicine. And so we were able to reduce her dose by about half. And now she's feeling much better. But she may never be able to get completely off thyroid medicine because she probably had Hashimoto's for 20 years before she started working with me. And so some people are able early in the process to completely eliminate medication, and others may just be able to reduce it over time as we regain that balance.
Julia, here's a question. Do you practice virtual medicine, or does this person have to move to Iowa City to become a patient of yours?
Anybody who is a resident of the state of Iowa can see me virtually.
Gotcha.
You don't have to come to Iowa City.
Gotcha.
But if you are not a resident of the state of Iowa, you would need to drive to Iowa and see me in my office.
Okay. Okay. The other question I had, I'm trying to think how to, this person asked this. They sent us an email about cereal greens and wheatgrass and barley and oat and rye. And I think what it is, they've started taking a supplement that encapsulates all of those things. And they were wondering, good, bad, indifferent, should they be taking it? Should they stop?
Sure. So the green part of any grain is generally going to be quite healthy as long as you do not have a significant food sensitivity to that grain. So there's very little of the protein in the greens, but there's still some. Most wheatgrass supplements, for example, are processed in a way that the final product actually is certifiably gluten-free, in such a way that people with celiac disease would actually be able to take them and get the benefits from the greens. However, anybody who is very sensitive to wheat and cannot even tolerate the smallest amount of contamination, generally I recommend that people just make their own greens powder at home or make green smoothies with fresh greens. But my favorite way to mix it up is just have some dried kale, dried spinach, and then another one of my new favorite green powders that's out there is called moringa, and it's very high in iron. And I just mix up a green smoothie when I want one on the go without using a complicated powder with the 3 separate powders that I have in my cupboard. And so if you do suspect that you are sensitive to any of those specific grains, you might try taking it out for a couple of weeks and then putting it back in. And if you don't observe any changes in your health, any rashes, any changes in digestion, any other symptoms that are new or different for you, it's probably fine. And greens are a great source of prebiotics.
Well, I drink a green smoothie every single day, 5 days a week. And you've just encouraged me, you've inspired me to keep it because I love them. I didn't realize they were as good as they are, and I know quite a bit about them, but That's awesome.
They are tasty.
And they're tasty. Yes, taste good and good for you. Yes. Okay, is there anyone else that has any questions? Hold on one second, here we go. I got a few more, Julia. Julia, are you okay? I want to be cognizant of your time as well. Okay. Is progesterone and testosterone absorption affected by gut maladies or gut health for that matter, especially post-menopausal? That's the question. It's two questions in one, really.
Yeah, it's a good question. So absorption of all substances can be affected by issues going on in the gut, especially the small intestine. I'm not aware of any specific changes that would happen in absorption after menopause for women, but I do see a lot of postmenopausal women with bacterial overgrowth that needs to be treated. Usually once we treat SIBO, absorption in the small intestine increases exponentially. I mean, you do not need as high of a dose of most of the vitamins that we need pre-SIBO treatment to just get people in the normal range. And so sometimes what will happen is if you are taking hormones and you do have an issue in the gut that needs to be addressed, then you see a functional medicine physician and get that addressed. You might need a smaller dose of hormones because you're going to be absorbing it better. And so I always recommend after any kind of gut treatment that about 6 weeks later, you make sure to get a test done to make sure that you're on the right level of hormones still. Good question.
Julia, a follow-up to that. What do you recommend for treatments for Candida, which seems to be a common malady in our culture?
Yeah, so there are conventional prescriptions that I use, mostly azoles, fluconazole, voriconazole, itraconazole are the most effective. However, they do carry risks when taken for a long time, for example, more than a month, to the liver. Now that risk is pretty low. I've only seen someone have liver damage from that class of medications once in the last 10 years, and I've treated a lot of people with them. But just to make sure that we keep anybody who's taking those medicines safe, if you take them longer than a month, and some people end up taking them for 6 months or more, if they have a significant Candida issue, we send you to the lab every month and make sure we check your liver function and that everything is looking good. Now, for those who prefer to avoid conventional antifungals, there are a lot of great herbs that will treat fungus just as well, but the doses need to be high and concentrated. You have to take it usually more times throughout the day for a good clinical effect, and you need to take it longer. So if one person has a certain level of Candida that can be treated by 2 weeks of fluconazole, a prescription medication, you may need to take 6 to 8 weeks of an herb like garlic or oregano or cinnamon or grapefruit seed extract, which all have very good clinical efficacy against most strains of Candida.
Let me see here, Julia, see if there's any more questions. No, I don't see any more questions, Julia. I think we'll end. Much gratitude to you for this. It's incredibly helpful. This is a conversation that I probably have 10, 15 times a week, immune system in the gut. And anyone who's out there who wants to know information on Julia, I don't think we post that. And we'll give you information. It's not a long ride over to Iowa City. And Julie has been very busy, so maybe I'm telling you all that. Maybe I'm not helping her, but But anyway, her practice is called Upstream Functional Medicine. And I'm sure Julia would be happy to take new patients if those of you who need her. I know she's a wonderful doctor, and she's also a wonderful person. And that always goes together well when you're seeing a physician who cares deeply about people and spends time with you and cares for you, things like that, simple things. So with that, Julia, thank you so much. Everyone here on the call, thank you so much for being here with us tonight. And that concludes our session together. Thank you.
Thank you, Tim.
You betcha.